let's start with the Chris Kaba story, because it's really rocketed in the last 24 hours, because we know that Chris Kaba was a gangster. He had convictions for firearms offences. He'd shot and wounded a man less than a week before he was shot dead himself. Was the judge in Sergeant Blake's trial right to withhold all that information from the jury, Andrew?
Look, I think it's inexplicable what happened. The jury would have probably concluded this was a scally, a bad man, because so many police were pursuing this car, which had been linked to a shooting. And they took 3 hours after a 3-week trial to convict, to acquit the police officer. If they'd known a tenth of what the judge released yesterday, they'd have done it in 3 minutes.
Yeah, but just to point out, the police officer who shot him did not know all of that information about him. So, in fact, it was not relevant to the trial.
Well,
it was he knew the car was associated with the shooting.
And the car had been associated with a shooting.
But he didn't know who the person was driving the car.
But still, I still think if you were a juror, one of those jurors yesterday, you read what the judge said. No, so I knew, as a journalist, I knew what was coming. I knew the judge was going to release these details. I knew other people, but the jury weren't entitled to know.
Because what's allowed in trial is what's pertinent to the trial. And if the police officer himself didn't know all of this about that individual, then it's not pertinent to what he did.
But they would argue, you could argue that the person driving the wheels of a car wanted in connection with a shooting was probably...
Well, I suppose you could, at a stretch, you could say that the way that the car was being driven back and forth in an attempt to break out of the lock, you could say if you knew the background of the driver, you could interpret that driving and the way he was using the car as a weapon in a slightly more aggressive way.
Yeah. Why was he so determined to get away? If this guy was not a bad man, he could have turned the engine off and got out the car.
The point is, the jury have to judge the facts of the case, and the facts of the case on the ground were that the police officer didn't know the details of Chris Kaba. What I find... there's lingering concerns, of course, about this, not least that this officer was named back in March. And now there is what the tabloids are calling a bounty on his head of £10,000. I just want to remind viewers of the reasons why the anonymity order on the individual officer was lifted. It was Judge Mark Lucroft who lifted the anonymity order back in March after media organisations challenged the legal application to protect his identity on the basis that confidence in the criminal justice system requires cases to be held wherever possible in public. And in his judgment on naming him, the judge said that significant information had emerged about a threat to his safety in the aftermath of the shooting. He had examined the intelligence about the threat to enable him to make his decision. He said that as the trial approached, attempts might be made to find out more about Mr. Blake, and he had considered whether there was a real and immediate threat to the officer's life or to his family. In my judgment, he concludes, the naming of the defendant or giving of the date of his birth does not give rise to a real and immediate risk to his life. I find it extraordinary that the judge could have made that order. Jonathan, does that strike you as strange? I mean, I know that justice needs to be seen to be done...
Indeed. ...in
order to be served, but it now seems this guy is at risk.
Well, indeed. Look, and I'm not a politician anymore, but when I was a politician... well, that helps me, actually, because I was going to say that as a politician, you always have to be careful to be objective around the judiciary, to respect their independence, to not try to put undue pressure on the judiciary. We have a separation of powers. That is something that every MP has to take into account when being asked to comment on these matters. Look, judges have to make decisions on what they think is the best way in order to deliver a fair and objective trial. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not trained in these matters, but I think we've got to decide that if the judges think that's the most appropriate way to approach these things, it has to be...
OK, but now you're not a politician.
It looks like he was wrong.
Andrew just said I was, but anyway.
Yeah,
but it looks like he was wrong. If there's now a £10,000 bounty on the guy's head from a much-feared gang...
I think there is a broader point here, which is firearms officers put their life at risk every day to defend all of us and to keep the public safe. It's a very controversial job, given what has happened in this trial, but we need those officers. They need to be part of our police service, and I know a lot of them were deeply, deeply concerned about this trial, but now will be really, really concerned that this has happened.
And it's not over yet. I mean, Sergeant Blake, he's been acquitted, as you say, quite quickly after a 3-hour session by the jury. He still faces an internal disciplinary hearing, and he could face the sack for gross misconduct.
Look, I said yesterday this man is a marked man, and he is a marked man. I think when he's not just Joe Public shooting someone, that's his job, to protect us, Jonathan, to protect all of us. It's a very high risk, highly charged job. He doesn't get paid any extra money to be an armed police officer. I think the way we should go forward with this, if you're going to prosecute an armed police officer for firing a gun in that way, he or she should be named if they're convicted.
Right.
Because his whole family now, his whole family is at risk from a vicious gang of gangsters. The bloke, Kaba, was a vicious gangster.
Well, yeah, OK.
And he's part of a vicious gang of gangsters, and they're after him.
OK, and it seems to be true that there is, you know, a threat to the officer's life. I think there is still a question, even though he's acquitted of murder, absolutely, why he had to be shot in the head. I mean, there are still lingering questions.
Well, in evidence, he says he was aiming for the chest. What we don't know was Kaba crouching, so we don't know. But he said he was aiming for the chest, the stomach, to try and to save him, not to kill him.
Of course,
but still could have killed him. Yeah, but don't forget
this guy. And why wasn't the car disabled rather than the individual who was driving?
That's the split-second decision they take, isn't it?
And also, you know, we need to hold people to account, of course, but we also need to hold people responsible, allegedly, for crimes. We need to see Chris Kaba. If he's responsible for criminal activity, he needs to be in court.
That guy was reversing backwards and forwards. He thought the car was being used as a battering ram. He thought police officers' lives were at risk. What, you shoot one tyre? The car can still move.
So what do we make of the National Police Chief Council? They've now lobbied the government and they said, OK, up with this, we will not put any longer. We want proper protection, legal protection for armed officers. We don't want to see a prosecution like this again.
Well, don't forget, they downed tools a few months ago.
They had the guns in,
So
what do we think? What do we make of that?
Well, I think
a change in the way
there has to be.
A policeman might be prosecuted after a fatal shooting.
Well, look, I mean, these things can... there can always be reviews about you know, when we're in these situations like this, but also fundamentally, right, if a police officer shoots somebody, you know, and in circumstances where it shouldn't have happened, then of course there has to be prosecutions and inquiries. You can't be immune from that. I mean, this case has gone a particular way, and we respect the courts, we respect the judgments, but you cannot give carte blanche immunity.
I don't think anyone's saying that, but you say, can you give them more protection, i.e. anonymity in the case, as and when they're prosecuted?
Well, the National Police Chiefs Council has said they want to make it harder to find officers guilty of unlawful killing at inquests. And also this right for the accused to remain anonymous, to which, you know, even with your politician's hat on, I think everybody feels that absolutely that is a legitimate call. The changes would cover all use of force while on duty, not just shootings, while offering greater protections for police drivers who injure members of the public or crash. So your concern, Jonathan, is that we would lose some sense of accountability.
Well,
because police officers have enormous power in these cases as well, don't they?
Well, I mean, the protocols can always be reviewed and looked at, and of course, you want to maintain the confidence of your police, your police services. Firearms officers put their lives at risk every day of the week to protect the public. So, of course, you need a regime which they are happy with and confident with, but you cannot have a situation where they feel like they can shoot people, break the law and not be held to account. So you've got to get the right balance.
Well, what do you make of the head of the Met, Sir Mark Rowley? He stepped into this now. He said yesterday that he wants prosecutors, I'm quoting him, to provide a rationale on charging decisions, and he's lobbying for a suite of changes that would raise the threshold at which officers are investigated for misconduct over the use of armed force.
Yes, and exempt officers from criminal charges over fatal shootings unless prosecutors can show that they deliberately departed from their training.
But these are matters for the court, though, aren't they? I mean, the CPS would have thought it had rationale.
I think that would be a matter for the CPS.
You know,
I think that's his point.
The CPS would argue there was a rationale. It then goes to a judge. The judge then has to decide whether the case can proceed. So the judge needs to be reassured that there is a rationale. So those safeguards are in the system already. I mean, that quote from the Met suggests to me that they want immunity. Almost. I mean, you've got to get the right balance there. Look, as I keep emphasising, you know, I totally understand and accept that firearms officers are a really important part of our police services and put their lives on the line every day of the week. And I want a situation where they feel they can go to work, they can carry out their duties on behalf of the public, not feel like they're going to be prosecuted gratuitously if they make a genuine mistake. Well, but you can't give them exemption in every circumstance.
No, there does seem to be a public thirst, though, for change. I mean, we've got so many messages on this. Isn't this one? This is Tracy. She said, this officer's name should never have been made public. No. What happened to innocent till proven guilty? And yet another one who simply through doing his job has been forced to hide away for fear of retribution. It's disgusting. And we have an anonymous one here saying, my son is an armed police officer. I don't want him to be anymore.
No, I'm sure that's right. And why would you? Why would you want your partner, your son, daughter, to be an armed police officer? Because he was doing his job under enormous pressure. Enormous pressure, and his family is now at risk, and he's gone into hiding. It's a shocking outcome. He's now become a victim.
Pictures of the officer remain restricted.
Yeah. For how long?
You can't publish those.
The internet, you know what will happen? The pictures will end up on the internet.
Meanwhile, yesterday, separately, we had these inmates released, the latest tranche of inmates released because of overcrowding in prisons. Jonathan, celebrating in some cases, with one prisoner saying, big up Keir Starmer, as he was picked up in a convoy of a white Bentley and a black Mercedes G-Wagon. Asked on Tuesday if the Prime Minister was happy he was being bigged up by criminals, Downing Street said no. The Prime Minister's official spokesman said Sir Keir shares the public anger over the situation. Well, it's under his government that these criminals have been released.
Yeah, but why have they been released? It's because the prisons are completely jam-packed and overcrowded, and because, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to say it, because for 14 years under the Tories, we didn't, but it's true, though, we didn't build enough prison places. And the previous lot who were in, Rishi Sunak's government, let out thousands because we don't have enough prison places. That's the problem, right? There is not enough space in these prisons, which is why these prisoners are getting released early. What we need to do
is more prisons.
We need a proper rehabilitation programme, but we need a proper review of sentencing. But yeah, we do need to have appropriate number of prison places. Of course we do.
Are we likely to see 14,000 prison spaces delivered under this government, do you think?
No. And building prisons is very unpopular. Nobody wants a prison near them. Hugely expensive. But, you know, there's...
Can we expand the prisons we've got, then?
Well,
because presumably communities where there is a prison have got used to the fact there's a prison on their doorstep.
We've also got about 11,000 foreign prisoners in these jails. Can we not have return agreements where we get them out?
What about the proposals we didn't have time to get into yesterday that are being discussed now by government, which is basically home prison, home arrest? House arrest.
Well, I mean, you have that in a sense, don't you, now, because people, they have tags. So, but I just think it depends on the nature of the crime.
Jonathan Ashworth, what message does it send to all of us, but particularly people who might be convicted of these sorts of offences? Actually, you'll serve 40% of your sentence and then you probably get out. It doesn't feel like a kind of tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, which was once a Labour slogan. Well, what sort of deterrent message are we sending out to people who want to commit crimes with these sorts of sentences and everybody else who might be a victim?
Well, look, let's be honest, it's not a new thing that people don't serve their full sentence. We've always had that in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, but it went to 50%. That felt, you know, a little bit kind of wobbly. Now it's gone to 40% in these cases.
Well, look, as I say, it's not a new thing.
It's even serving half of their sentence.
But the problem is there isn't enough prison space because the Conservative government over 14 years didn't build enough prisons. Now, look, you know, you're right to be sceptical whether Labour's going to be able to build more prisons because the state of the public finances this Labour government has inherited is shot to pieces. This is a big black hole.
Keeps getting bigger as well, doesn't it?
A big black hole in the public finances. We're going to get a budget next week where we're going to see how Rachel Reeves is going to fill that black hole. But look, you know, I get your exasperation and frustration and anger on behalf of the viewers. I'm angry as well, but you know, this Labour government's been in power for just over 100 days. It's not going to be able to fix all the problems it's inherited in 110 days.
We also had, I was just going to talk about the Justice Secretary.
You do that.
Well, Shabana Mahmood was on the programme yesterday, and we put to her a very specific case, Elizabeth Hudson, who was assaulted by her now ex-husband. And he was convicted assault occasioning ABH, threats to kill, and non-fatal suffocation in the case of another woman. But then she was sent a letter saying that he was eligible for early release. It seemed a terrible situation where we thought that domestic abusers were not going to be eligible. And yet in this case, because of what appears to be a legal technicality, this chap is now eligible for early release. That seems to be a failing of victims of domestic violence. We've asked the Ministry of Justice and we asked the Justice Secretary if they would look into this particular case. Our conversations are ongoing. But Jonathan Ashworth, this seems like they've dropped a ball.
Well, I mean, I'm not familiar with the details, but it does feel...
Well, the guy held a knife against his wife's throat in the kitchen and threatened to kill her.
I mean,
it was a classic case of domestic abuse.
I mean, that does sound to me, whatever this legal technicality is, the Ministry of Justice or the appropriate powers need to look at that pretty urgently.
And the Justice Secretary was incapable of saying that.
Well, she seemed confused because this guy has a restraining order on him, and there seemed to be some confusion over whether that meant that he was exempt or not exempt from the early releases going on. And she basically said she'd have to go away and have a look at it. But we've been looking into this, haven't we?
Yeah, he's subject to 2 indefinite restraining orders, and Elizabeth Hudson, who was speaking to us yesterday, said that that should be an exemption from early release. Now, in the case of restraining orders, you're only exempt from early release if you have breached a restraining order and then convicted of breaching a restraining order.
So the order in itself?
Yeah, the fact that there is an order in place does not mean...
Outrageous.
I mean, it just, honestly, if I was the victim of this
Shocking.
kind of crime, I'd just feel like you're dancing on the head of a pin, to be honest.
And most of the victims of domestic violence are women, and they will be terrified, knowing that this bloke could be out soon, thinking, is the guy who beat me to...
And the fact he's got a restraining order on him, directly affecting this woman, couldn't be greater proof that we're talking about domestic abuse.
It's shocking.
Well, we're trying to follow that story through. It won't be the last you hear of it on this programme, I promise you. Can we talk about Labour and Donald Trump? On and on and on it goes.
Well, hang on. We've got somebody here who seems to be directly accused.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Well, OK, the story this morning is that Donald Trump and his party are outraged that Labour has is sending about 100 staff to help Kamala Harris in her campaign. They're kind of on their way, and they're going to be campaigning in the key states, the swing states. And he says that's outrageous intervention, and they've lodged a legal protest in America. You went out there, didn't you? To their convention.
Are you meddling?
Are you meddling in
the American election?
Look, they don't need any advice from me on how to win elections or indeed lose elections.
Why did you go then?
So I went to the Democratic Convention in Chicago back in August.
Well, just for the fun of it?
Basically, yeah. To meet sort of political figures in the US and learn about what's going on over there. Look, a couple of things about this. First of all, the Labour Party is not paying for people to go and campaign.
No, but it said that they'll organise their accommodation.
No. The Labour Party is not...
Yes, they've said that on an email.
No. The Labour Party, I think, suggested that if anybody volunteers at their own expense, in their own time, wanted to go there, they could put them in touch with Democrats who could put them up and, help them and tell them where to go.
They're going under the umbrella of the Labour Party. The Labour Party is sort of organising this and saying, get in touch with us, tell us where you're going, and we'll make sure you've got accommodation. I mean... You can read that for yourself.
The Labour Party was literally just putting people in touch with the Democrats. Anyone who goes over there goes over at their own expense as volunteers. And that has happened, by the way, in US elections since forever. In the same way that Democrat activists, Republican activists have come over and helped out on the ground at their own expense in UK elections. And indeed, some of the people who are huffing and puffing about this...
Donald Trump.
Mr Nigel Farage, he was been over there on platforms for Donald Trump, campaigning for Donald Trump. So why is he not interfering then?
That's a good point. And of course, Obama came here and told us we'd be going to the back of the queue, didn't he, in terms of trade agreements if we left Europe. So you could call that blatant interference. But the fact of the matter is it's perception. And the man who may very well be the next president of the United States is furious with the Labour Party, the governing party of this country. Not for the first time. You all know what David Lammy said about him. So isn't that giving us a problem if Trump wins the election?
Well, Keir Starmer has been very clear. His guiding mantra has always been country first, party second. And he will work with whoever the American people put in the White House. The special relationship between the UK and the United States is absolutely steadfast.
Do you believe that the special relationship still exists?
Yes, of course it does.
Really?
absolutely.
Andrew,
I'm just intrigued. Why would it, with all respect to Jonathan, why would they want him?
Oh,
I mean, he was one of the few Labour MPs to lose his seat at the last election. Well, how many Labour MPs lost their seat? About 4, and you were one of them. Why would they want him?
That's a respectful question.
I'm sorry, but why would they want you out there anyway?
They said to
Are
me,
you going out there to be a saboteur?
They said to me, aren't you that guy who's...
The saboteur.
They said to me, aren't you that guy who's always on the telly with Andrew Pierce?
They said,
Can you introduce us to him?
You were supposed to be in the cabinet but lost your seat on a swing of how much? What was the swing again?
Oh, you're so mean.
I'm just telling it as it is.
I think your mum knows.
I think he had a majority of 22,000 and still lost. So why is he not going to do Donald Trump, Kamala Harris any good anyway?
Andrew, I think that people might think it's all very well for the Labour Party to do that when they're not in power, but for the Labour Party to be in government and then campaigning for a particular candidate in a foreign election.
Yeah, and you know, this takes way back to when Clinton was campaigning, was it 96, and John Major's Tories sent people over to assist the Republican, and it caused a big problem with Clinton, who won the election, and it rumbled on. Yes, it did, and it rumbled on for a long time.
And so that is what Sir Keir Starmer faces if these... Let me just tell you what was in that LinkedIn post. A senior Labour Party official said on LinkedIn, it's now deleted, by the way, I have nearly 100 Labour Party staff, current and former, going to the US in the next few weeks, heading to North Carolina, Nevada, Pennsylvania and Virginia. I have 10 spots available for anyone available to head to the battleground state of North Carolina. We will sort your housing. I mean...
That's organising, isn't it?
But anyone who goes at their own expense. The Labour Party doesn't pay for them. All that Labour Party...
This is a senior Labour Party official sorting it out.
But all they were doing is saying they would put you in touch with people in the US who would put you up at your, in their spare rooms or whatever. The Labour Party is not paying for anybody to go. It's for people to go in their voluntary capacity.
You haven't answered that one. That it's all well and good to do this in opposition, but when you're in government, to actually, for the party of government, to be sending, all right, you say they're not sending, but to be orchestrating to some extent, 100 party members to go and campaign for one particular candidate, it's not good politics, is it?
But this is not a new thing.
Party staff, by the way, not members. Party staff.
Yeah, party staff.
This is not,
and that's what caused the problem with Clinton and Major. They were staffers.
This is not a new thing. This has gone on in politics forever. Conservative Party activists have gone over and helped the Republicans. Republicans have come over and helped the Conservative Party. And the Democrats and the Labour Party do have long-standing links because we're both a progressive party.
But is it going to be awkward? Our colleague over at Sky, Beth Rigby, is with the Prime Minister en route to Samoa, and apparently Keir Starmer has said his relationship with Donald Trump hasn't been jeopardised after the Trump team filed that complaint against what it calls blatant foreign interference in the election by the Labour Party. He says members helping out Harris team volunteers are doing it in their own time. But it's going to be, if Trump wins, it's going to be pretty orcs, isn't it, at the first sit-down dinner, where he goes, Sir Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the UK, you were trying to stop this happening.
Well, I mean, I've got no idea what Donald Trump will say to Keir Starmer.
Oh, I think we've got a good guess. I think we can make a good guess.
Donald Trump and Keir Starmer have had a dinner. They have started building a relationship.
Yeah, that was before he filed the complaint.
About that on the plane. He said to Chris Mason that he doesn't think there's going to be a problem, and he's pointed to you're right, a 2-hour dinner he shared with Trump at Trump Tower in New York last month, about 4 weeks ago, and he says we established a good relationship and we're grateful to him for making the time for that dinner. So he's saying nothing to see here, it's all fine.
Yeah, but that was before this filing with the Electoral Commission calling illegal foreign campaign contributions and interference in our election. Look, Andrew.
Trump Trump doesn't forget either.
Right, and also, Trump is a mischief maker.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So Jonathan Ashworth and the Labour Party and Sir Keir Starmer say this has been going on for ages.
He doesn't care about that.
Donald Trump doesn't miss a trick.
No.
And if he can leverage something to his advantage and say foreigners are meddling in this election, he will do it, and that's all people will hear.
And it's all your fault.
You should never have gone.
Oh, my goodness, right. Let's talk about the Alzheimer's drug, which is apparently going to be blocked for use on the NHS. Regulators expected to declare the new treatment for the disease safe for use, but the rationing body for the health service is going to rule it is too expensive for NHS patients. Oh, my goodness.
Very effective drug.
Yeah, and this is the second one they've blocked. So if you can afford it, you might be able to buy it privately, or if you're on a trial, but the trial will be very limited. And this is a great blow for people with it, because it slows it down, doesn't stop it, but it slows it down enormously. And I think that the regulators got to get with this, because we know how big Alzheimer's is becoming in this country.
You used to be Shadow Health Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth. You know about the financial pressures on the NHS, but when it comes to individual patients being blocked from using a drug which could slow it by 35% and give patients 2 extra years with their families. I mean, there's a price people would pay beyond measure for that.
Absolutely. And I think we all know, and you've covered it so many times on the show, how cruel Alzheimer's and dementia is, how it's so painful when you see a loved one develop dementia.
But with your expert knowledge, can you tell us this? Once any government has decided that a drug is suitable for use, however expensive it might be, once it enters into mainstream application, doesn't it become cheaper quite quickly?
Well, exactly. There's, supply and demand issues here. And look, the regulatory body has said this is too expensive at the moment. But when we know, the statistics are that I think 1 in 3 people born today are likely to go on and develop dementia in their life. And the numbers living with dementia is just going to balloon over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So the drug may well be expensive now, but that doesn't mean that the door is shut on it.
OK, good.
I mean, the Health Secretary, I would argue, should get the manufacturer in, should get NICE in, and see if a deal can be hammered out.
Absolutely.
And that has to be a priority.
OK,
thank you very much indeed.
We'll leave it. Thank you both very much indeed.